In some of my videos, you'll hear me use the phrase, the Negro only defines what is black through a white liberal lens. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that definition in this video. Now, when I say the Negro only defines what is black through a white liberal lens, my point is that whatever this white liberal tells most black people to believe is black, he says is black. And this is something I have observed, over the years, just looking at black people, that they always seem to look for the approval of this white liberal in regard to their culture and their identity. And unless a white liberal is there to tell them that something is black, they will not believe it as black. And this is just something that I have observed, most recently when I was just publishing this book last year, ISIS Wrath of the Cyber Goddess. When I published this book last year and I presented it to my own family, they told me that the images that are on this cover were not black. Even though I designed these, even though I hired an artist to design this cover, and the skin tones clearly are African American, and the features are African American. I also ran into that same cognitive distortion when I published these two books with the Kickstarter. Now, clearly, these two images are African American images, but I have been told, they're not black enough. And that in some cases, one of these pro-blacks came to me and said that the characters are too light-skinned for him to consider being black. Now, from what I've learned, over my years, black is a whole spectrum of skin tones and skin colors. But when it comes down to our media and our own images, we, in many cases, allow white liberals to tell us what black is. And the reason why this is dysfunctional is because if this white liberal is telling you what black is, then what are you telling yourself? Because if you're not defining the terms of what African American is, then who is defining what African American is? And this is something that, many African Americans just aren't thinking about in regards to their own race and their own identity. The whole thing is that this white liberal has been controlling the African American culture for many, many, many years, and the whole thing is now he's dictating the terms of what black is, and many black people just don't see it in regards to their own image and their own media. And the whole thing is that the situation is getting progressively worse when we think about, issues that have happened in most recently in American media. Thanks to Bill Clinton signing the Telecommunications Bill of 1996, now most of the American media is controlled by a big six conglomerate, which includes Sony, Warner Brothers, Disney, Viacom, News Corp, and NBC Universal. And this big six pretty much controls all the newspapers, all the TV networks, all the magazines, and even portions of the internet. And this group of liberals pretty much controls, all the images of African Americans. And because these people, control so much media and we don't control next to anything, our image of self is being defined by other people, and that's very dangerous. Because when somebody else is defining your image of self and telling you what is black, then, again, what are you telling yourself? And I ran into that same cognitive distortion with these three book covers. The one for ISIS Wrath of the Cyber Goddess. People told me this wasn't black. For the East Team Undercover again and Night of the Vampires, I was told these images aren't black, or they're too light skinned to be considered black. But it's created by a black man. The books are written by a black man. The characters were created by a black man. And how is it not black? How is something designed, with black culture and black history not black? And it clearly shows me, the cognitive distortion in many African Americans' minds regarding their own race and their own identity. However, these same African Americans will go out and they'll pick up an image of a storm or a Black Panther, and then they'll tell you that this is a black character, but not understanding that this character was created by white liberals, white Jews, and is their interpretation of your black culture and your black history from a distance. Meanwhile, the characters that I create, such as your ISIS and your East Team, created by a black man, and and incorporate black culture, they'll tell you that that's not a black image, That's not a black character. And it clearly shows you, the backwards nature of the African American Negro as it relates to his identity. Now, the African American Negro's identity wasn't always like this. I mean, I remember going to the Schomburg about a decade ago, and I saw this exhibit called Stereotypes and Human Types. And inside this exhibit, they showed you on one side of the room um, images of African Americans as the white liberals saw them in media. And on that side, they showed you all the pickaninnies, all the coons, all the brutes, all the, characterized images of African Americans in media with the big lips, the super black skin, and the butchered English language. They even ran an Amos and Andy episode that I had on VHS a couple of years ago. They ran 2 episodes of the Amos and Andy cartoon with the minstrel antics, and they showed all of this media to show these were the images that the white liberal and white supremacists presented as what they thought black was. And then on the other side of the room, they showed images of African Americans as they really were. They showed, pictures of African Americans from the 1900s and the 1930s up to about the 1930s or the 1940s, well dressed in suits, polished professional black people. They showed, things from black businesses. They showed images from black advertising, and they showed, pictures of black people as they saw themselves. And in these images of self, where they showed, how African Americans, saw themselves, we saw a more balanced picture of African Americans. And this is what happens when we defined our image through our own lens. We saw, these balanced, humanized images of African Americans. You saw, people going about their business. You saw people who were pretty much the equal of white people. And this is how we saw ourselves. This is how we saw who we were. We defined, our culture and our history through ourselves. And this is the way it was for many years. I can even, this is how we defined ourselves, up into a certain period. I'd say about 20 years ago when, the, minstrels with attitude came along and a Two Live Coon. Now, I would even go, even further back and say even parts of the 70s, during the whole Black Pride movement, we had, again, the liberal, again, trying to define our image through that lens. And we know with the jive Negroes, the pimps, and all these other people they tried to put on film. And some people did imitate these guys. But again, for the most part, African Americans, when you look at our own media that we created, like in magazines like Ebony, and that started in the 70s, and even in our own independent films, you will see that more balanced, humanized image. And the same thing, during the 80s with the Cosby Show and other images, you would still see that us defining our image. But I'd say about 1989, 1990, here came the Coons with attitude and the Two Live Coon, and all of a sudden we get the African American image, defined by the white liberal. And here he is, taking our image and, projecting, again, his ideas of what black is. And the sad part is, just like in the 70s with the jive Negroes and other assorted stereotypes, some people adopted this as black culture. But what's more disturbing about this whole adoption of culture, more people began to adopt this characterized image of black as a norm, and it became the standard for the black culture. The whole thug and gangsta and other assorted, images, which were just repackaging of minstrels. We were made to believe that this was the African American identity. And for the past almost, I say 25 years, sadly, in many cases, it is pretty much stuck for many as the African American identity. And we're not seeing, a balanced picture of what African American is. What we're really seeing, in most cases, is what the white liberal wants us to see as an African American image and what makes them comfortable as black. Because if we just started defining, what black is, I guarantee you it would be a bit more balanced. But the whole thing is that so many people have been brainwashed by this white liberal's interpretation of black that they don't even see anything else as black. If you present them with images that, go outside of the white liberal's box, then they pretty much vehemently reject them. And examples of this can clearly be shown, in the ratings for shows like Empire, the box office for movies like No Good Deed, and it just pretty much shows how, the African American identity is being colored by the white lens. And I'll also go in and talk about, shows like Scandal and Blackish, which we think, these shows, are black because there are black people in them, but the ideas, are clearly colored by this white liberal's definition of what black is. It's not defined, by African Americans themselves, and it's not us telling our story of who we are. All we're getting is what the white liberal's interpretation of us is in his eyes. This is how he sees us, but this isn't how we see ourselves, and it's not a balanced picture. I mean, what's being presented in media today, is really distorting people's minds, about what black is. And again, if somebody else is telling you who you are, then what are you telling yourself? And more importantly, what are your children telling themselves? Because this is one of the reasons why I got into, publishing and writing, and I wanted to create these positive stories about the African American experience, and I wanted to, diversify this African American book market, because we need to see, different types of stories, different viewpoints, and different ideas, so we can get that more balanced picture of what African American is. Because right now, everything is pretty much, following the white liberals' narrative. And if you look at most media, it follows this narrative of victimization, especially, feature films. If you look at the feature films regarding African Americans produced by this liberal, they all follow a certain narrative, and that narrative is the narrative of victimization. Every black character you see in a popular African American film usually is some sort of either stereotype or there's some sort of victim. And in many cases, they like to use the victim role, to say that without this white liberal, this Negro can't do anything for himself, that he's a helpless, pathetic person, and without him, guiding this poor Negro and cleaning him up, he can't be a human being. This is why the liberal always picks two eras in black history always to tell stories about in film. He'll always choose slavery, where he can always show the Negro as a downtrodden victim, and he'll always choose the civil rights period, where the Negro is always being victimized by, hardcore racists. He won't talk about the Reconstruction period, where African Americans pretty much showed that if you give the African American Negro some freedom, he will go out and build his own communities. He'll go out and build his own businesses. He'll create economic power. He'll have political power, because at one time, during the Reconstruction, we had black congressmen, we had black mayors, we had a black political base, and it wasn't until the Reconstruction was over that all of that was, done away with by the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations. But they won't talk about that era, nor will they talk about, the eras of the 1920s or the 1930s. They won't talk about the Harlem Renaissance. There are numerous periods, where we see African Americans, growing and thriving and building things and doing things, but we won't see those stories from the white liberal, because they don't fit his narrative. And anything that does not fit his narrative, he discards. And then the sad part is the Negro starts to discard, because again, the Negro in many cases wants this approval from this white liberal. He wants to, be accepted by white people. So he's not going to talk about those stories in history. He's not going to talk about those periods in history. And he's not going to, even try to discuss them even with other black people, because, again, everything that the Negro does, he does for the approval of whites, and especially this white liberal, because he feels that if the white liberal approves of him, he will be accepted in America as a human being. He feels that if he takes on this white liberal's version of black, he'll be accepted as a part of America. And this is truly a backwards way of thinking, because one, it gives away all of your power, and it allows someone else to define you. And two, you're not the one controlling and dictating the terms of what black is. The whole thing is that when we define what black is, again, it's completely different. I can even go and talk about another era people won't talk about, which is the golden age of hip hop. This was black people defining their own music and defining it, in their own way. I mean, if you listen to old school hip hop from about 1978 to about 1986, 87, or I say God go as far as 88. It's a completely different style of music. It's very positive, and everybody's talking about empowerment, or they're trying to be very good with their lyrics. They're showing their phonetic skills, or you get songs like your Self Destruction, where people are talking about black on black crime, or people talking about economic empowerment, or they're talking about positive things. When we were just finding our own music, we got a whole different sound. But as the minute the minstrels with attitude came along in 1989, and the Two Live Coon came along in 1990, and the white liberal began defining hip hop, all of a sudden it becomes a minstrel show filled with thugs, gangbangers, dope dealers, malt liquor, guns. That's what the white liberal sees as black. But when we were defining it as black, you just saw guys rapping, you saw guys dancing, you saw guys using phonetic wordplay, you saw people being really creative, and this is what happens when we define, what black is. And that was like a golden age that I grew up in nicely, and learned, all about black culture, because our art and stuff was being defined by us, and it's not being defined by us these days. And this is why I say that, the Negro's identity is defined by a white liberal lens. And sadly, an entire generation is now learning what black is through the white liberal's lens. And this is very dangerous, because, again, you're not learning about who you are from people who look like you, or even in some cases, people who look like you who are concerned about your best interests. What you're getting is a distorted picture of what black is. And this caricaturized image of what black is pretty much every one of those minstrel images that came all the way back. I can go back all the way back to the 1930s. They're all being, repackaged and rebranded as what black should be. Because I look at films like Your Monsters Ball, Your Precious, shows like Your Empire, many of these gangster rappers, and I see the same racist stereotypes. And I'll even go talk about No Good Deed yet again. I see the same racist stereotypes being put in brand new boxes with bows and ribbons, and many Negroes are still going out here thinking that this is black, and they're supporting this stuff, and they're not understanding that this is just a repackaged stereotype, and you're now believing that this is normal. Yet when somebody black creates an image, you'll tell them that that's not a black image, and that you're trying to be white. And the irony is, you have the black person who is trying to show you what black is, and you're taking your identity and the images that from this white person and telling you that that's black. And that's it clearly shows the cognitive distortion regarding the African American Negro on his own identity and his own culture and his own art. And it just shows me how things can change in a generation. I mean, at one time we were defining who we were and defining our own art and defining our own culture, and now somebody else is doing that. And with the Big Six in more and more control of it, we're seeing more and more, negative images of African American, and even downright racist images of African Americans. And in many cases, they're getting people like your Lee Daniels to produce these images of African Americans so they can have some sort of legitimacy. And we look at these images, we look at the shows like Empire and Scandal, and because they put a black face in front of it, we don't see what the white liberals, behind the camera, creating this media and creating projecting these dysfunctional ideas in the minds of people regarding the African American identity, the African American culture, and the African American experience. And the whole thing is that over the last 20 years, we've had no counterpoint, out there. In the mainstream media, there have been people who have produced things like Ava DuVernay, and what's his name, Steve McQueen, and even guys like myself who have been trying to publish literature, but that stuff doesn't get any press because the liberal doesn't want it out there or people talking about it because, again, it does not fit his narrative. He does not want to see African Americans on a balanced playing field. He doesn't want to see African Americans on an equal level. He wants the African American Negro to be seen at the bottom as this sort of pathetic person because that's how he views African Americans. And in his eye, your African American Negro is a pathetic person that just needs to be, pitied and looked down upon. And if you clean him up, if you take him, wash him off, teach him a few things, he can go from a savage to a halfway decent human being. But he can never be the equal of the white liberal. But in actuality, if you look at the real images of African Americans, especially those from the Reconstruction period down south, and even those here in the North, where when African Americans were left alone, African Americans pretty much built their own culture, built their own communities, and they weren't a bunch of savages. They had nice, thriving towns and nice, thriving businesses, and a nice cultural center. And we've had that, and they don't want to tell that story. The liberal doesn't want that story told. He does not want black people to adopt their own identity. He doesn't want them to adopt their own culture, because he's going to lose out a lot. One, it's going to refute every idea he has about African Americans, and the whole state of this Negro being some sort of savage. It's going to refute those ideas. And two, he's going to lose a whole bunch of dollars, because as long as you're buying into his version of black, he continues to make a bunch of money. But when you buy into your own version of black, you start, building your own community and building your own economy, and you start making a statement, about your own community, and you start using your own economic power to create political power. And in some cases, you will just pretty much look at this liberal and see him for what he truly is, a con artist who is, leeching and exploiting the African American community to make money off it. And this is what the liberal has been doing for many years. He makes all his money, off this African American Negro. He needs the Negro to be in this submissive position so that he can continue to take, 98% of his money and live his lifestyle off of it. And, this is what happens when you see yourself through that white liberal lens. And this is why I'm asking many African Americans, to start taking a look at themselves and start defining what they believe is black, instead of letting somebody else, define what is black. And this is one of the reasons why I became a publisher, is because I wanted to define, what black is. After reading all these different books about African American culture and African American history, and seeing the exhibits, produced by black people, and seeing who we really were, I wanted to create those positive images so that the next generation could see themselves. And other things I wanted to do, like the fantasy book market and stuff like that, I wanted to, define who we were so that everybody can understand what we are, and make that social commentary about who we are as African Americans. Because when somebody else is telling you, who you are, again, what are you telling yourself? And this is the question many African Americans just don't ask themselves. And then they don't ask, other questions like why. This is why I say, why there aren't any black superheroes or stuff, because we're not defining this. We're letting other people tell us who we are. And in their picture, we're in the background and not in the foreground. And when you're in the background, you're insignificant. Nobody really cares about you, and you really don't have any value. But when you, do what I do, like with these covers here and on these books, you're at the front. The black person is in the front of the cover. The black person is telling the story, and it's making a statement about what black is. And this is why I work so hard on, these type of projects with my own money, because I care so much about black people, because I want to, again, define what black is as I see it. And I really feel that it's important that more black people go out and define what black is, and support, books like I'm producing, because these kind of stories are presenting a more balanced picture of what black is, and, presenting what we really look like and how we really can operate, and, puts us in the lead and puts us in the forefront, where everything is, where we need to be. And, because when you put yourself first, and when you put your image on the front of something, it says that you're a leader. It says that you're important. It says that, you are taking control of your life, and, making a statement about who you are. And what I'm seeing with many African Americans is that they're pretty much content with being in the background of a white liberal's picture and seeking the approval of white people, just so they can get a little bit of acceptance. And that's not how life was meant to live. I mean, God made, life to be for us all to live to the fullest, and we have to start seeing ourselves, prominently in our own picture if we want people to take us seriously. If people, see you seeing yourself as valuable and putting yourself in the forefront at the forefront, and making yourself the center of the picture, that makes a powerful statement, to the world about what black is, because that means you're defining what black is on your terms, and you're making a statement about what black should be. And this is what black people really need to get back to, because this is what we did, way back in that period, like Reconstruction. We were making a statement. We have our freedom and we have an opportunity to make our own statement about what black is. We can do what just like everybody else. We can have our own community just like everybody else, and we can control our own community like everybody else. We don't see ourselves through somebody else's lens. We're dictating the terms of what black is. We're creating our own black culture, our own black identity, and you know what? And ours is just as good, not just as good as anybody else's, but better than somebody else's. And if people started thinking that way, it would make a powerful statement about our African American culture and our African American identity, because it's saying that we see ourselves through our own lens, and we're telling our own stories and presenting our own pictures of ourselves. That's all I have to say for this video. You can pick up all the books that I've presented in this video. Isis Wrath of the Cyber Goddess. This is available in paperback and on Kindle Unlimited.